What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with another daily video. If you guys are enjoying these daily videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of these, let alone all three, helps the videos to do well and ensures I can keep making these types of videos for a long time to come. If you guys are curious about any censored words in the video, I've been getting a lot of flags for inappropriate language, quote-unquote, recently, so I'm doing my best to ensure that I don't get flagged. Because I've been getting flagged pretty much immediately when I post a video, it has been affecting the channel a little bit. So if you'd like to support the channel even further, go ahead and click that join button below the subscribe button. It's only $2 a month, and you get a special symbol next to your name when you comment, and you get to use special emoticons as well. No content will ever be locked behind a paywall, of course. It's completely optional, and only if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Just watching this video is enough already. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. I'll see you again at the end. Have a great day. I was laying in bed one night, unable to fall asleep, when a memory resurfaced. It was one I'd occasionally think about, or rarely retell, but tonight it struck me as particularly disturbing. Maybe because it's the sort of thing you can only completely appreciate the implications of once you're an adult. I'm not sure if it's the scariest story of all time, but it's true and I'll share it here nonetheless. I'm around 13 years old and getting ready for school one morning. My dad is off at work, and my mom is getting ready for hers, I think. Pretty much every day, I'd walk to school. It was only about a half a mile away from my home. I'm ready and head out the door, saying goodbye to my mother. I walk down the hill of my yard and down the curved street in the direction of school. At this point, I'm out of view of my house, but not too far away. I reach the point where my neighborhood ends, where I would cross the street towards the intersection of the school. Right before I was able to, this dingy-looking black minivan pulled up right in front of my path, poised in front of the road parallel to my neighborhood. This was a car I'd never seen around before or since, and I recognized most of the people in my neighborhood. I looked at the man inside, and I could tell he was eyeing me up as well. He was this pasty, Caucasian-looking man who seemed to be in his 30s at the very least. He was extremely disheveled and had long brown hair. What struck me the most about him was his eyes, though. He had these really dark circles around them, and a very uncomfortable dead stare. His window was up, but he motioned me toward him with one hand. My heart began to pound. Every part of me was saying this was not a good man. I just stood there, looking at him, and shook my head no. Some part of me had the distinct feeling that he was going to jump out of his vehicle and that I needed to be prepared to run. That's not what he did. He didn't even respond to my gesture. He just looked at me completely unfazed, blocking my path for a while longer, before suddenly pulling out of the neighborhood into the road ahead. Just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I don't remember what happened next. I think I ran home rather than towards school, as I was extremely startled. I told my mom later that day. She told my dad, who's a policeman. When he got back, he called me into the living room. He was on his work laptop and wanted me to describe the man and the car for him. I didn't have much useful info to give. I was a dopey middle school boy who wasn't prepared to memorize plates on a moment's notice, or at all knowledgeable about cars. Unsurprisingly, my dad never really found out anything more about this man with such sparse details. The day came and went as just an odd thing that happened to me, and nobody had any reason to bring it up again. Every so often, though, I will remember that time of the creepy man stopping in front of me and beckoning me towards him in his dingy black van. Only recently, as the thought filled me with so much dread. I'm pretty sure that if I would have followed his instructions, I would have never been seen or heard from again. Just another middle schooler who gets swallowed up by the world and disappears. There were no witnesses around. It would just be an unsolved mystery in my forever grieving family. I shudder to think about what could have happened to me, as I now know what people like that are capable of, and death isn't nearly the worst thing they can do. Maybe it's all just in my head. Maybe he just wanted some directions or to ask me something, even though his window was closed and he looked extremely unwell to say the very least. The worst part is that I'll never know. All I know is that when I saw him, every part of me was screaming that something was wrong with this guy. Remembering how it felt just looking into his eyes fills me with despair. What's even worse is the idea that either before or after this happened to me, he might have done it to another kid who didn't have the smarts to shake their head no. Back in 2008, I used to date a girl who lived in Abergavenny, South Wales, UK. This is a very old Welsh market town, with various old buildings and a vast ancient history. Anyway, my ex, let's call her Cece, used to live in this old toll house with her sister and mother, on the corner of what used to be a main road many hundreds of years ago. It has the classic two-door look, with exposed black limber beams crisscrossing white-painted stone walls. Although the house had extensive renovation in the early 1900s, the site and the layout had remained unchanged for several hundred years. The downstairs lounge room was set quite low into the ground, with the house effectively built on an embankment, meaning the rear wall of the lounge was under the natural ground level. Cece would mention how behind the rear wall in the lounge, there used to be an old access tunnel that led to the nearby castle some 500 meters away. The ruins of that castle are still there to this day. The tunnel had collapsed hundreds of years ago, and the entrance was boarded over. This rear wall even had the remains of the tunnel's stone entryway archway as a feature, but was blocked off beyond a single layer of masonry. It was common in medieval times for monks at monasteries and castles to use these access tunnels to travel in and out of the grounds and out of the townships. Anyway, the collapsed tunnel behind the lounge room always used to intrigue me. It had a cold draft no matter what time of the day it was, which I never really thought much of. That was until strange things began to happen. The first curious event that occurred was when I wasn't actually there. I was on the phone with Cece one evening, chatting away about our days at school and any other rubbish 15 or 16-year-olds would talk about. Suddenly, mid-sentence, I heard this whooshing sound and an extremely loud bang. Cece let out a tiny yelp on the other end of the phone. There was silence, and I asked if she was okay. Eventually, after 5 seconds of that deafening silence, she responded shakily, "Yeah, my books just started flying off the shelves from across the room at me." She brushed it off as if it was nothing. "Wait, what?" I asked her. She replied, "Yeah, it happens all the time. My house is very haunted." She was so casual about it, and I found that a bit comforting, honestly, considering I was going to be staying there that coming weekend. It also made me wonder, though, this is normal for her? Nothing happened for some time. One evening, about 2 months later, though, we were sat there watching TV in the lounge downstairs when I heard someone shuffling around upstairs. "How long has your sister been home?" I asked, to which she replied, "Nobody's home. Nobody is. She just texted me. They're all out." I looked up at the ceiling above, as we could clearly hear shuffling footsteps on the upstairs level, creaking the floorboards. The footsteps were muffled and soft, like someone who was creeping around. We were both very creeped out. We snuck upstairs to check and make sure that no one had broken in via the rear window. A burglar had done so quite recently. We found absolutely no one there, and every door and window was properly sealed. We went into Cece's bedroom and closed the door behind us, leaving it only slightly ajar. We sat there in quiet, waiting to see if we would hear those footsteps again. After several minutes of sitting in this eerily quiet and uneasy atmosphere, we decided to head back downstairs. We were hearing nothing, and there didn't seem to be anyone up there. The next thing that happened is something I'll never forget, though. As I approached the bedroom door, I reached out to the handle to gently push it open. The door was only open a sliver, and not on the latch. As my hand was pushing it open, the door suddenly slammed right in my face, like someone had shoulder barged it from the opposite side. Instinctively, I tried to turn the door handle to open the door, but I could feel the force of someone turning it against me. The knob turned with some resistance eventually, as though someone were holding on to the other side. As I pushed it open, it snapped back closed with some force. The only way I can describe it, as though it was actually a person on the other side, trying to keep us in that room, holding the doorknob as hard as they could, and leaning all of their body weight into the door itself. I could even hear the old timber door creaking under the pressure of something pushing it from the other side. Suddenly, after a few seconds of this, the resistance disappeared. I turned the doorknob and the door swung open completely free. Absolutely no one on the other side. There was no way a person could have done that and hidden somewhere in the house that quickly. We rushed from room to room, but we couldn't find anyone hiding. All the windows were closed, all the doors were still locked from the inside. It suddenly occurred to me that while I was trying to open the door before it slammed shut, the sliver of light that should have been passing through the ajar door was not there. It was pitch black, as if the dead of night was on the landing, or something very dark and translucent was blocking the light from coming through that gap in the door. And that thought still creeps me out to this day. From then on, things literally started to go bump in the night regularly. I remember one night I was in the guest room and got up for a piss at around 3 a.m. The toilets were downstairs. As I was heading to the base of the stairs, I heard a loud thump from the lounge room. I stared into the pitch black beyond the old crooked doorway leading into the lounge room. I could tell the thump was coming from the rear wall, like someone's fist softly knocking a hollow plasterboard, as if someone or something was behind the hollow wall where the collapsed tunnel's entrance was. I stood there frozen in shock as the thumps continued over and over. My eyes were watering with fear like I've never experienced before. I bolted upstairs and woke up Cece. We sat on her bedroom floor together, listening to the thumping go on for 30 minutes or so. Gradually, it grew softer and softer until disappearing altogether. I'm sure other events happened that I wasn't there for, or that I didn't notice at the time. Her mom used to drink a lot and regale us with vague stories of moaning she heard from behind the lounge room wall most nights. I remember I even saw Cece's bedroom door open behind her on the webcam on its own, and her mirror getting thrown off her wall and smashing to the ground. Whatever was in that house, it had a sad but sinister feeling to it. We broke up not so long afterwards, and I never went back there, but I did drive past that house recently, some 16 years later. It gave me chills like nothing else in a long time. So, I really had zero intention of sleeping in my car that night. I was out with some friends in downtown St. Louis, bar hopping and just enjoying the night, you know? But then I lost track of how much I'd been drinking. By the time it really hit me, I was way too hammered to drive home. I also didn't want to blow money on a hotel, though, or figure out an Uber back to the suburbs. At that point, I made the dumb decision to just sleep it off in my car. I ended up parking in this small, mostly empty lot near the riverfront. It seemed quiet enough, and there were no sketchy vibes about it, at least at first. My car's an old sedan, not exactly built for comfort here, but I tried to make the back seat work. I grabbed a ratty sweatshirt from the trunk to use as a pillow and cracked the windows just enough for some air. The streetlights above were flickering, giving off this weird, eerie glow. I was way too tired and too buzzed to care, though. Eventually, I drifted off. At around 2 a.m., though, I was woken up by a tapping on my window. My first thought? Great, a cop's gonna bust me for sleeping here. But no, it was not a cop at all. I squinted out the window, and there was this figure just standing there, right up against the glass. The light from the street was barely illuminating them, just enough to make out the shape of someone in a hoodie standing way too close to my car for comfort. I tried to play it cool, thinking maybe they'd just go away if I didn't react. Instead, they started circling my vehicle, slowly dragging their fingers along the glass. My heart was pounding. They stopped at the driver's side door, and I heard them try the handle. Thank God I'd locked it. They then moved to the back window, where I was lying down, and pressed their face right into the glass. I couldn't see their face clearly, just a shadowy outline of eyes staring right at me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I was hoping they'd get bored and just leave. After what felt like forever, they stepped back a bit, but they did not walk away. I stayed there frozen, trying to figure out if they were still there without getting up. Finally, I worked up the nerve to sit up and peek out through the windshield. There they were, just standing 10 feet in front of my car, staring at my vehicle and not moving. I don't even remember grabbing my keys, but all of a sudden I had them, hands shaking as I started the car. The second the headlights flicked on, the person bolted, running off into the darkness. I didn't stick around to see where they'd gone. I just floored it out of there, driving until I found a busy, well-lit gas station, where I stayed for the rest of the night. My doors were locked, my headlights were on, and I was wide awake. The next day, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, whenever I drive past that part of town, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure again, lurking in the shadows. When I was in high school, I moved to a major city suburb. While the majority of this area was suburban in appearance, there were still some rural features as well. One thing I hated about this area was that it did not have the best lighting. Streetlights in my area were very scarce, so it was always extremely dark at night. My house was situated at the corner of a street and avenue. My house faced the main street, which was a few miles long and led to many neighborhoods in the area. The avenue that my house was on ran perpendicular to the main street and was about a quarter of a mile long. It was made of about 6 houses or so. The avenue was almost entirely gravel. At the end of the avenue, the gravel ended and dense vegetation began. The dense vegetation eventually led to a state forest. At the time, I had been dating a girl that lived in the area. In order to walk to and from her house, I traveled the main street previously mentioned and walked all the way to the end of that street. At the end of that street was a small field. Walking through the field led to a wooden fence. The wooden fence separated the backyards of multiple houses, including hers from the field. After leaving her home one night, I realized it was a lot later than I thought it was. It was after midnight, and we had school the next day. I wanted to get home and get some sleep. After she locked her fence door and went inside her house, I turned around and started making my way through the field. As mentioned previously, this area had virtually no lighting at night. For this reason, I opted not to use the sidewalk and instead walked in the middle of the main street. I did this mainly to get a better monitor of my surroundings. Walking in the middle of the street meant I could use the moonlight and avoid walking extremely close to trees. At this point, I was nearing my home and approaching the area we called the Black Hole. We called this area, the remaining half a mile to my house, the Black Hole, because it was the darkest stretch of the journey home. There were no streetlights at all, and it was completely surrounded by trees on all sides, pitch black. After entering the Black Hole, I began to hear this strange sound. It was too far to make out clearly, and I thought it may just be an animal. I didn't think too much of it and continued walking. I could see a car approaching in the distance, so I momentarily made my way to the sidewalk and waited for the car to pass by. After I made my way back into the middle of the street, I began to hear the sound again. I realized the sound was getting louder, so I decided to increase my pace. As I was nearing my home, I continued listening in the hopes of determining the origin of this sound. The longer I listened, though, the louder it seemed to get. Eventually, the sound was so loud that I could clearly make out that it was a forceful inhaling and exhaling of air. I was terrified. I knew whatever was making that sound was now extremely close to me, but I decided I would not look back until I got near my house. That way I could utilize the light from the only streetlight in this area. I could hear the inhales and exhales getting louder and louder and louder until I finally neared the streetlight. I worked up the courage to turn around and was shocked by the sight that greeted me. When I turned around, there was a man right behind me, not on the sidewalk or on the side of the road. He was so close to my back that if he tripped, he would knock me over. I looked into the man's eyes, and he looked into mine. He then abruptly slipped around me and ran down the avenue that I lived on out into the darkness. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. I have a few more creepy stories that I don't mind writing about, if anyone is interested in reading them. Back in 2022, me and my dad decided to hike up Mount St. Helens. We hike together all the time, so this is really nothing new. In fact, I'm going back for another hike up the same mountain tomorrow. One thing was different than the rest of the hikes this time, though. Mount St. Helens is a little over 4 miles up with about 1 to 2 miles through a wooded area before you start hiking up the rocky open parts. Just as we exited the wooded part and started hiking up the first set of rocks, we heard a voice call out to us. The voice screamed, "Dad!" It sounded exactly like my brother. We had come with my brother because we were on a trip in the area, but this was one of the activities we had planned where he did not want to come with us. My brother is out of shape, very unathletic, and hates hiking. Once we heard this voice, me and my dad turned to each other to make sure we weren't hearing things. Sure enough, we both heard it. Without a doubt in our minds, we instantly agreed it sounded exactly like my brother. Since we were 1 to 2 miles in now, we knew it was almost definite that he had not come this far with us. We stayed there for a good amount of time to make sure someone wasn't behind us or something, but no one came. No one passed us coming down for a good amount of time either, so it couldn't be that. To make matters worse, a fog rolled into this area while we were watching for people, so we took no chances and just continued the hike up. We made it to the top and came back down with no more problems. Once we got down, we asked my brother if he'd come up with us, and all he said was that he never did. This experience has left a strange mark on our brains that me and my dad will never forget. We completed the entire hike again the next day with no problems. But when we passed that area, there were always people around, unlike last time. As we were walking through the forest on the way back, I kept having this distinct feeling of being watched. I never saw anything, so I don't know what this was all about. I was about 13 or 14 at the time this happened. It was summertime, and during the summer, me and my friends loved to go on the trails at the nature preserve at night. It's quite creepy, and we loved the adrenaline we got from it. Now, most of the trails are quite short, but one of them is 2.5 miles long and goes through half the entire nature preserve. We had always been scared to go down this trail at night, but this time we decided to face our fears and just go for it. We go down the trail, which was a gravel road. It was quite wide, so we were all spread out next to each other on our bikes, about 6 of us in total. And the trail was surrounded completely by woods, as you might imagine, and there was no light at all to make it extra creepy. We decided not to use any flashlights as to not interrupt the atmosphere, which was a terrible idea, and you'll see why later on. We were going down this trail when, out of nowhere, we suddenly stumbled across 8 deer in the middle of it, just standing still. For some reason, one of my friends has always had a fear of deer. He was panicking and trying to go back. We didn't want to let him go by himself, though, and we also didn't want to leave the trail quite yet, so we forced him to stay. Out of nowhere, the deer suddenly started running away into the woods, as if they'd just been startled by a potential predator. You know how when you're in the woods you hear all the crickets and frogs during the night? Well, all of a sudden they all went quiet. It was complete and utter silence. We were all freaked out, standing in the middle of the trail and expecting a bear or something to pop out. We stayed in place for a minute or two until all the sounds came back and everything seemed to be normal. I don't know why, but even after that, we still had the will to keep going down the trail. We continued on when the trail started to get very narrow, about 5 feet wide or so. We didn't realize we were at that point yet, so we kinda all smashed into each other and ate shit. It took a little bit to recuperate, but we got into the straight line and went down the narrow trail. At this point, the trail went from gravel road to a small and narrow dirt path. The following moments are by far the scariest of my entire life. We were going down this narrow path in a single file when I looked over to my right and noticed a bit of light. We were next to a road off in the distance, meaning we were nearing the end of the trail. Now, I was looking at this road, not paying attention to what was in front of me. At that point, I ran right into the person that was ahead of me. It was like a domino effect, and we all fell down. As I was getting back up, I started to hear the sound of wood knocking all around me. We all heard it. We were surprised. We began to hear people talking. You know what it sounds like to be in a room full of people saying things? So you hear people talking, but you can't make out what they're saying? That's exactly what this was. At this point, the voices stopped, and we noticed a silhouette standing on the road in the distance, looking right at us. We took this as a sign to turn around and leave right now. We started to race back. As we were riding as fast as we could, my bike chain broke. We stopped to fix it as fast as we could. As we were fixing it, the woods went quiet again, and we heard footsteps from all around us. As soon as it was patched up, we booked it the hell out of there. As we exited the trail and got back to the road that my neighborhood is on, we heard what sounded like a woman screaming coming from the trailhead. We raced home and never went back to that trail again. First of all, let me start this by saying that I'm no writer. I suck at writing, really, but I wanted someone to share my story. It was 2012, and I was dating this guy named Michael. He had stayed the weekend at my place, but had to be back in Darlington for his work at stupid o'clock in the morning. My dad, coming off his shift, told us that he would drive Michael home, only about an hour or so. 3 a.m. comes, and me, Dad, and Michael all pile into the car. It was all very normal so far. We get to Darlington and drop him off, then get back on the road home to South Shields. It was about 4 a.m. now, and it was pitch black outside. I was not scared, though, as I had my dad with me and he was ex-army. Don't ask me how, because it should have been a straight road home, but somehow we actually managed to get lost. It was like a horror film. This thick bank of fog just came in out of nowhere, and we couldn't see jack shit with our headlights or even with the high beams on. My dad came up with the idea of keeping close to the car in front of us, which worked until we lost the car in front. There we are at 4:30 a.m., roughly in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. We came across this tunnel as we were trying to find our way home. By this time, I was really stressed out. I begged my dad not to go down this dark and foreboding tunnel, but my dad, being my dad, drove down anyways. It was an incredibly short tunnel. The other side opened into a town of some sort that seemed to be very small. Hand on my heart, a bunch of people suddenly came out of the darkness and surrounded our car. They just stared at us. It was some real Children of the Corn type stuff. They just stood there, surrounding us and staring. My dad immediately started to back up, and the people behind us stumbled and got out of our way. My dad backed us out of that tunnel and slammed the gas out of there. It took us another hour to get home, but thankfully the sun was starting to come up by then. To this day, I don't really understand what happened. Why did all those people come out of the darkness in that tunnel and surround us? They didn't try to attack us or anything either. They just stared at us so coldly. But anyway, that's my story. When my cousin and I were 18 and 16, I would regularly pick her up from her house at night, and we would go down to the beach to smoke some weed. We lived in a beach town and would frequent different public beaches to try and keep it random. At this time, weed hadn't quite been decriminalized yet. It was around 2008-ish, I believe. The entrance down to this particular beach was down a steep road. Once you came down the hill, the road flattened out to a long one-row parking lot overlooking the water. We were always on the lookout for cops driving down there. Once you were on the hill, you would be able to easily identify a cop car and make your plan to leave. There were also random cars that would come in and out, doing the same thing that we were doing, but no one ever really bothered each other. One night, I had picked my cousin up, and we drove down to the beach and parked in the lot right next to the sand. We started our usual nightly activities. The occasional car would come down the hill and park and then leave later, but for the most part, we were all alone there. That is, until a minivan came down the hill and pulled into the lot. They didn't turn in to park, but instead sat there for a few minutes with their headlights pointed straight at the driver's side of our vehicle. My cousin and I were getting quite annoyed, of course, since the car was blinding us. We debated on leaving. At that point, the car drove toward the end of the lot, past where we were, and turned around, this time pointing their lights directly on the passenger side of the car. Now we were starting to get paranoid. We hoped that maybe they were looking for someone, maybe thinking it was a parent looking for their teen partying at the beach. We just sat there and waited for them to leave. With some relief, they finally started to drive away, and it looked like they were leaving. As they passed the back of my car, though, the minivan stopped perpendicularly to our vehicle, blocking us in completely. We kept trying to look into our mirrors to see who was inside this vehicle and what they were doing. We tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, but this quickly subsided once we heard their car doors open. I turned to my cousin and said that we needed to get out of here right now. I quickly turned on my car and gunned it forward onto the sand, which was my only option. Somehow, the car had enough traction that I managed to turn around on the beach and get back onto the paved parking lot towards the entrance. The van immediately began to follow us. I sped up the hill out of the beach area. They kept my speed down the entire street, while my cousin and I screamed in terror. Fortunately, I grew up in the surrounding neighborhood and managed to lose them after some quick turns and prayers. We never saw the van again and stayed away from that beach for a while. Looking back at this situation, it seems like it easily could have been people trying to grab us or do who knows what to us. Definitely not anything good, though. A few years back in 2020, me and my friend went into a sort of far part of a forest by his house in Colorado. If you want me to specify, it's Black Forest. Now, let me kind of give you a visual. It was my friend's house, then if you head deeper into the forest, you run into a little abandoned home, and after a little while, you get to a sand canyon. It wasn't just me and him, though. It was his sister, his dogs, and his sister's friend. We all headed into the forest, and I started to hear something that I couldn't really describe. The best way I can remember and describe the sound is as though someone was stepping on a twig nearby, but very, very quiet. We found ourselves at the sand canyon, overlooking a creek. We'd usually walk down, but today we decided to slide down. I was the first one to reach the bottom. After I fell onto the grass, my friend's sister said, "Hey, do you guys hear that?" "Hear what?" my friend said. "That clicking sound." We all responded no. We chalked it up to her dog maybe stepping on something. After that, my friend and his sister's friend slid down, and now it was just my friend's sister. As she was sitting down to slide, it got quiet enough for all four of us to hear these human-sounding clicks, for lack of a better word. The dogs broke the silence immediately as they began barking at something amongst the tree line. In one motion, me, my friend, and his sister's friend ran back onto the hill the sand canyon bordered and booked it straight back to the house. I didn't really hear anything chasing after us, which really made me feel a bit silly and makes me wonder about this next part. After we arrived back to his house, we all went to the table and began to talk about that strange experience. Everyone else chalked it up to various things, but I knew what I'd heard sounded distinctly like a human being moving around out there. After we ate dinner, the day progressed further, and we decided to sleep outside, right next to the forest. Now, this next part comes from my friend. He said it happened as I went inside to use the restroom. As they were about to connect the speaker, my friend's sister was playing with a flashlight. All of a sudden, though, she felt like she was hearing the clicks of the button a little off sync. She stopped for a second, and the clicking continued. My friends didn't waste any time. They jumped up and ran back in. I was about to put my shoes on when they all ran inside and told me the clicks from earlier had returned. We decided not to sleep outside that night and instead stay inside. Their story doesn't end there, unfortunately. Later that night, after I was done using the restroom, I was in a half-asleep state when I began to hear that noise again. That same mysterious clicking sound. This time, though, I thought my friend was doing it as a joke. I didn't think about it until the next morning, when I asked them if they'd done that as a prank last night. They were all confused when I asked, and told me they were all dead asleep. That was when we looked around the cabin and noticed that a window we had shut had been opened during the night. Me and my friend kind of grew apart after 2021, and I've only been back into that house and that forest once since. Never heard those mysterious clicks ever again, though. I was 8. My sister was 5. Somehow, we got it into our heads that to walk home from school would be a better idea than waiting for our parents to arrive. They were already late to pick us up. The area was pretty rural back then. We were enjoying the sun shining down on us and feeling quite grown up when all of a sudden a silver sedan slowed down right by us. A man with a mostly bald head, black gloves, and a big smile leaned over and swung the passenger door outward. We had to step around him. He told us that our mom was sick and he had been sent to come pick us up. I started to get a bad feeling immediately. I had never seen this man before, and I didn't think my parents were friends with anyone like this. The man tried to reassure me. "It's okay. Get in. Do you like candy?" He gestured to a small pile of Halloween candy laying on his car seat. His eyes were locked on my sister, and he only briefly glanced at me. I took my sister's hand and tugged her alongside me, saying no like my dad had taught me. The man started backing up, keeping us within range of his open door. He told us to get in the car over and over. The smile was now gone. I'll never forget how hard his gloved hands were squeezing the steering wheel. Eventually, he gave up the ghost altogether and shouted at us to just get in the fucking car. I was starting to cry and was beyond scared. That's when he tried to grab my sister. I yelled at her to run, and we did. This maniac actually kept reversing in his car to keep up with us. There were only fields and abandoned lots around us. Eventually, I heard him slam on the brakes, and I knew we had to take that opportunity to hide. I pulled my sister over this wooden driveway-like thing, built over a ditch, and into one of the abandoned lots. It was severely overgrown. I pulled my sister down onto the ground, and we laid in some very tall grass. She was crying, but I put my finger to my lips and she went quiet. We stayed there hiding on our stomachs, while I heard sounds of a car door closing and footsteps walking through the gravel on the side of the road. There was tons of swearing and more footsteps, clearly searching for us. Eventually, we heard a passing car and a car door closing. He started up his engine and drove away. We stayed hidden. I felt frozen. I was so scared. After a few more cars passed by, I slowly raised up my head, and the man seemed to be gone. We ran home, our hands glued together. We made it there just fine, but that was one of the most terrifying days of my life. Oh, and of course, my mom was not sick. This happened about a year ago. I live in a safe Eastern European country where not much crime happens. I'm originally from the Middle East, and I only speak the local language a tiny bit. Me and my girlfriend, who is local, and another friend of ours from England who was just a tourist, decided to go for a picnic during the weekday to this one famous park. The park is a famous destination for picnics, but weekdays in the mornings it was mostly empty, beside the main area where people would occasionally barbecue, and some food carts would sell ice cream and snacks and the like. After we hung out in the park for a while, we decided to go. Our friend from UK saw some of the items on the food carts, and she was interested in trying it, since it was a new culture to her. She was talking with my girlfriend about the various foods, and I was trying to find some coins since the clerk was not accepting cards. I mostly paid by card, so we spent about 10 minutes like this. The vendor seemed a little bit too friendly, though. He left the back of the food cart and came to our side to talk with us in his broken English. He was talking about football with our friend from UK and the politics of UK, making some racist comments about its president. We bought our products. He was still talking though and started to touch the girls, started being weird and yelling racist things about various people. We wanted to move on, but he refused to let us end the conversation. He asked our guest where she was staying, and when she went back if she was taking a plane or bus. Our naive little friend was answering his questions truthfully. At this point, I decided to take over the conversation and told the girls that we should start moving now. I thanked the man for his hospitality and for the items as they looked delicious. I waved at him and so on because he was still talking and trying to walk with us. He was now about 20 to 30 meters away from his food cart. Eventually, he did say goodbye and leave though. I checked him after 100 to 200 meters. That was the last moment I could actually see his cart due to a curve in the walking path. He appeared to be serving another person, so I simply moved on with my life. Now that we'd left this main area, we had about 3 kilometers of walking until we saw someone else. We walked about 1 kilometer and came across the toilets that you put a coin in and the door is unlocked. I had to use the bathroom, so I went in. Both of the girls were outside, but as I was washing my hands, I suddenly heard the girls begin screaming. "He's back! Oh my God, what does he want?" Suddenly, they started screaming even louder. I rushed outside, only to see that vendor from before grabbing both of the girls by their arms and pulling them towards the toilets, telling them something I didn't understand. This guy was about 50 to 60 and was relatively small. As soon as I got outside, I charged the man to take him down. He immediately started backing away, putting his hands up as if to show his surrender or that he was friendly. I stopped and pushed the girls behind me. I told them to walk fast and told the man he needed to leave right now. My girlfriend told me he was telling them that he was dragging them inside the toilet with him so they wouldn't have to pay multiple times. We immediately started moving away from this man, the girls walking behind me, and the man following and focusing on me, still trying to look friendly and asking my friend if she was taking a plane back home. I just wanted to make sure, so we walked another way to confirm he was following us. At that point, I figured I could legitimize the use of force towards an old man if it came to that. We changed our route and he continued to follow us. At this point, I took a look around and called an Uber in the nearest direction. He continued to follow us. We approached a couple of buildings under construction. We were about 2 minutes away from the Uber, which had already arrived. All of a sudden, the guy rushed forward, swearing. I grabbed his arm and pushed him to the ground. He recovered and went back to a certain distance again, but still continued to try and follow us. At this point, he started mumbling things no one could understand or answer. My girlfriend told him to go back to his cart already. He'd left it unattended. Wasn't he worried about his merchandise? This really unlocked the guy's rage. He was angry and began screaming at us that there are no thieves in his country, only thieves in the UK and wherever we came from. At this point, my adrenaline hit the peak because this guy was really getting into a rage. All of a sudden, he began waving his hands erratically and bolted off toward the buildings under construction. At this point, I shouted for the girls to run. We ran to the Uber, and I turned back to see the guy. He was also running, but not towards us, toward the construction area where he'd been waving to. I didn't look again to his destination, though. We simply climbed in the Uber and went home. My girlfriend told me that we didn't need to go to the police, since they wouldn't do anything, and it would only take up our time when we had a guest. None of us know what was up with that guy, but it was quite a scary experience. So my girlfriend and I arrive at a remote stretch of forest around dusk time. We could see two strange-looking men sitting on some rocks a bit far away, but we didn't really think much of it. We drove 2 to 3 miles further into the forest and set up camp at that point. 30 to 45 minutes later, it was completely dark by this point, when one of the two guys we'd seen earlier suddenly walked right up to our camp and yelled out to us. I responded, and he asked to walk through. I asked him why, and he said he needed to reach the other side of the creek. He walked into some bushes and immediately turned off his light. I stood at the bank of the creek feeling suspicious about this man and watching him. He just stared back at me for 10 whole minutes. Eventually, he walked away in a different direction. At that point, we grabbed up everything we had, threw it into the car, and left. There was nothing in the direction he'd walked off to. No campsite, no trails, nothing. It was such weird behavior. I didn't even really think much about him showing up until he turned off his light and waited there in the bushes. That also left me wondering, where was the second guy? There were no other campers at this stretch of forest, and we didn't see any vehicles either. We were at the very last campsite on that road, and there was nothing past us. A couple of years ago, my friend and I were on our way back home from a concert at around 11 p.m. Because we were at a concert, we only had the necessities with us and nothing to defend ourselves with really. In the station, there were 5 people, 3 men and us 2 20-something-year-old women. The 2 first men were pretty normal, a businessman with a briefcase and a homeless man minding his own business. The third man, however, appeared highly intoxicated and was already shouting obscenities before we even entered the subway station. When we came down the stairs, the man noticed us immediately, and we definitely noticed him as well. He was wandering around in circles, muttering to himself with a huge liquor bottle that was 2/3 of the way empty. We sat down on a bench near the businessman to wait for the train to arrive. As we waited, nobody really talked much. It seemed we were all paying attention to what the man was saying, trying to make sense of it in case something were to happen. Eventually, we started to understand what he was actually saying. The man was screaming, talking about how he wanted to rip mine and my friends' faces off. At this point, my friend and I were panicking because this was the only train that took us where we needed to go. It was almost there when the man began going on and on about how he was going to kill us, rip our cheeks off, and fuck them. The train came after 3 minutes as the man began to approach us. We got on, and thankfully the man did not follow. This happened a few years ago when I was 17. My grandparents on my mom's side rented out a big cabin in a campground near the Canadian border for a bunch of my family to go on a weekend fishing trip. It was an actual campground, but had this big restaurant and gift shop area as well. There were 5 cabins, each about 150 to 200 feet apart. All of it was about 500 feet from the lake/river that we were on. In between the lake and cabins were some fire pits. The fire pits and seats were dug into the ground, so you had to use stairs to get in and out of them easily. They were also facing the lake, away from the cabins. That meant if you were sitting in the fire pit, it was impossible to see the cabin area. The cabins were big, but with 14 people and being one of the only girls, I ended up on the futon in the living room. Saturday night, most of my family was gathered around the fire pit. I was just laying on my futon, and my 11-year-old cousin was sitting in the chair next to me, playing on his phone. The lights were off in the cabin, and it was getting just past dusk outside. All of a sudden, I heard the sliding glass door open. I looked up and could see a man stepping inside. I couldn't make out much about the man, as it was dark in the cabin, and the little light that was coming in from outside was backlighting the person. I couldn't really make out any features, just a silhouette. Still, that silhouette was enough for me to tell it was no member of my family, and it was clearly a man. My heart sank. The man stepped into the house and started picking up stuff off the table, looking at it and setting it back down. I sat up, and the man's head immediately snapped to look at me. "Sir," I said. The man didn't answer. He began to walk toward me. I just remember wishing my little cousin wasn't there with me to witness what might happen to me. The chair was facing away from the door he'd entered in, so I don't think the man even knew he was in there with me. The man paused as he reached me, and I scooched back on the futon. "Sir, what do you want?" He reached out for me. I froze. I couldn't think of anything other than my little cousin being traumatized if he ended up witnessing something awful. All of a sudden, a girl my age appeared at the open glass door. "Dad, this isn't our cabin." She sounded out of breath like she'd run over here. He didn't say anything. He immediately turned around and followed her outside. I made my cousin go out to the fire pit with me to join our family. He had his headphones on, so he didn't hear anything during that whole interaction. I'd like to think it was just a simple mistake. By the way the man was acting, though, I just don't understand why he wouldn't answer me when I spoke to him if it was a simple error. I was walking alone at night down a reasonably well-lit street to the nearby convenience store when all of a sudden this guy drove past me and waved. I didn't recognize him, so I just kept on going. At that point, he actually pulled over and gestured me to come over to him. Of course, that was a swift no. I kept walking. The man actually turned around, stopped at a nearby corner, and gestured me over again. Once again, I chose to ignore him and kept on going to the convenience store. Sure enough, he actually followed me all the way over to the store. This was my cue to start heading back home, because this guy was being a little too persistent for my comfort. I turned tail and started making for home immediately. The moment I made it to my cul-de-sac, the guy followed me in and circled around the corner and stopped, waiting for me. I just sort of freaked out and hid behind a car, hoping he'd think I went into a home. Eventually he turned around, and it looked as though he was going to leave the area. Instead, he actually wound up coming back into the cul-de-sac to circle around multiple times and searching for me. It's a good thing I didn't think it was safe to come out from my hiding spot yet, or he'd likely have seen me. Finally, he left the area again, for what appeared to be good this time. I hauled ass faster than I think I ever have back to my home. I used to walk around at night all the time when I was younger, and nothing like that had ever happened before then. Now I'm definitely a little more wary about such things. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.